Hello, everyone. Good evening. I am happy to introduce to you guys Sam Carlson, who is joining us from Seattle and former UCYM staff member. He used to be our young adult coordinator, and we're just so happy that he can join us tonight. So to talk about Black saints in history. So welcome, Sam.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, it's good to be, even if just virtually, right? Serving Evanston in the Archdiocese of Chicago. So James reached out to me, and wanted an event for Black History Month. We talked about it and kind of came up with Black saints, right? Obviously, saints in the life of the church are kind of role models for us, ways in which we can kind of see what holiness and what following God looks like. From a particular, human perspective. And so, especially as we try to look at, some of the issues facing people of color today, specifically African and African-American folks, the saints are our go-to, right? Are kind of the primary examples of what does it mean to be holy, and to wrestle with, racism and prejudice and stereotypes. And so, want to take a look at that today and kind of talk about Black saints and Black Catholicism overall. So to start off, I want to talk about what is a saint, because I think there's some things that's important for us to clarify as we think about this idea of sainthood, before we get into kind of how Black saints, or what makes a Black person a saint or holy in the church. Okay. So first of all, right, saints are persons in heaven who lived heroically virtuous lives, right? That there's some aspect of their life that is a model of virtue in a way that's extraordinary, right? So it's not just like, I, did my dishes every day, right? Well, that's every day, right? But is there some sort of above and beyond extraordinary aspect of them that highlights, extraordinary virtue? They offer their life for others, right? They weren't kind of about themselves, right? They weren't kind of, just pursuing things for their own self-interest, but they're saying, how can I make the world a better place? And sometimes, right, were martyred for the faith, right? They were killed because of their faith in Jesus, and their consistency with that, their loyalty to Christ. So like that kind of combination is what leads to holiness. And then the church sometimes will say that they're worthy of limitation or imitation. And they are not necessarily perfect people, right? And I think that that's something to keep in mind, not just in this presentation, but when we look at saints in general, we can say, well, oh, this saint, they, were misogynistic if you read their writings. Yeah, that's a problem. They're a flawed human being. Or this saint had this issue. Yeah, right. Everybody, sins under, everybody falls short of the glory of God, right? But the importance is like, how faithful were you even when you fell, right? That kind of willingness to get back up and live a heroically virtuous life. And in many ways, it's kind of like relaxing, at least to me, as somebody who wants to be a saint one day, right? That I don't have to be perfect. I just have to strive to be, the best version of myself and what that looks like for me. And so I also wanted to make the distinction between a saint and a canonized saint, because a canonized saint is somebody who the church has officially recognized, right? And there's kind of a process that we'll talk about in terms of how the church does go through that process of officially recognizing somebody as a saint, particularly because they say that they're a valuable model for faithfulness here on earth, right? Just because somebody's not canonized doesn't mean that they're not a saint, though, right? Doesn't mean that they haven't lived a heroically virtuous life. Doesn't mean that they haven't offered their life for others, or, maybe even that they were martyred for their faith, right? Once you're a saint, you're a saint. But the church decides to recognize certain saints so that they can be a model for us who are kind of trying to figure out what it means to be holy today, right? So there's a number of people that as we go through it are maybe not necessarily saints, but are blesseds or servants of God, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not saints in heaven, but it's just that they haven't gone through the process yet. So what does that process look like? So the formal process for canonization, it starts with being a servant of God, and then a venerable. They're kind of two parts of the same coin. So first, servant of God is when the local church community decides to begin an investigation into the person's life and say, we think that this person lived a very holy life, and we want to begin the process of naming somebody a saint, right? So a number of famous figures who are currently servant of God, right? Thea Bowman is a servant of God. We'll talk about her in a second. Dorothy Day is also recognized as a servant of God. So they've begun kind of that investigation process. And then somebody is named a venerable when that process has been completed and the church has decided that, yes, they are, in fact, based on their life and based on what we know about them, they are holy, right? They lived a good life, right? They lived a life of heroic virtue. They lived a life dedicated to others. This is a good role model, right? That person usually will be named a venerable. And then the kind of distinction between venerable to blessed to saint comes through kind of supernatural means, right? So to be a blessed, right, the church recognizes someone who lived a holy life, right? That's the venerable piece. And they must have at least one miracle, unless they're a martyr. If they're a martyr, or they were kind of killed for their faith, right, that in itself is kind of seen as miraculous, right? A miraculous testimony of faith that somebody would be so committed to Christ that they would die for it. So after the first miracle, they are recognized as blessed, right, or they're beatified. And then after the second miracle, they're recognized as a saint. Okay, so it's kind of the investigation process begins, servant of God. Once that investigation ends and the church deems them worthy, right, then they're recognized as venerable, then blessed, then saint. Okay, so let's get into that. Black Catholic saints specifically. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of African spirituality and kind of what it means to be Black and Catholic, and the ways in which that's embodied for us specifically. And I'm getting these three from Dwight Hopkins has a book on Introduction to Black Liberation Theology, and he talks a little bit about kind of the origins of kind of Black culture and Black spirituality, at least within the United States. And he talks about the things that were brought over from the United States from Africa to the United States. And he talks about three things: integration of the sacred and the secular. So he says in the West, oftentimes there's kind of this distinction of holy spaces and secular spaces, or holy spaces and profane spaces, right? So like, if you want to pray or you want to see God, you go to church, right? But you don't see God everywhere, right? At least that's kind of like a common Western way of looking at things, right? Well, he said African culture, that wasn't the case, right? Africans could not conceive of a space as non-religious, right? Whether that be kind of in our life, right? The whole, process of life was a sacred thing. But also, right, like every space, every aspect of life, if there was a specific temple, but also, my home and also my, where I go to work, like all of this is a part of my interaction with God. There's no kind of dividing point there. The second one is this philosophy called Ubuntu, which is I am because we are, right? Specifically in contrast to things like Descartes when he says, I think, therefore I am, right? Well, that's one that's very kind of based on the individual person, kind of determining kind of who I am for myself, right? Ubuntu says that my identity is like, I am an individual, but I am an individual within my community, right? And so he says here, a human being could pursue her or his strengths and visions as long as they serve the communal well-being, right? Africans lived out an I am because we are style of life, right? This, centering this idea of relationship as, what defines who I am. And then lastly, right, this both and over either or, this idea that, it's not, either this or that, right? If we think about it in a Christian context, right? It's not either, grace or works. It's not either scripture or tradition, but a both and, right? This kind of inclusivity of ideas and of thoughts and, bringing everything together. And I highlight this partially because for me, this was a big step in my own kind of understanding my Black spirituality, my Black identity within Catholicism, because these are all very Catholic things, right? That something like food, right, could become elevated into the life of God in the Eucharist, right? That's a very integration of the sacred and the secular, right? The collectivist nature of vocation, right? That a calling is not simply that, you know, I decide what I want to be, but then also God decides and the church decides, and there's this kind of communal element, right? And then the church teaching on the things that I just said, right, emphasizes both. And so recognizing that there's an intrinsic connection to the Catholic faith and an intrinsic way of, you know, expression of African spirituality within Catholicism was for me a big revelation. And so I wanted to highlight that. And then I also wanted to talk about this clip by Thea Bowman. Thea Bowman is, you know, such an inspirational speaker, and, you know, we have the benefit of having, you know, received her from God in a time in which there was still, you know, media, even if it was kind of like older forms of media, right? But we have clips of her talks, we have clips of her speech. I think there's like a 60 minutes like clip from her actually. So because she's in that kind of living memory, we can kind of lean on her wisdom in that way, which is unique. So I want to play this clip. It's about 5 minutes, but it's her talking to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops on what it means to be Black and Catholic. And maybe for the folks who are here with us on the Zoom, maybe if we could listen and then maybe point out one like phrase or one quote that stuck out to you and why it stuck out. Okay.
What does it mean to be Black and Catholics? Catholic, it means that I come to my church fully functioning. That doesn't frighten you, does it? I come to my church fully functioning. I bring myself, my Black self, all that I am, all that I have, all that I hope to become. I bring my whole history, my traditions, my experience, my culture, my African American song and dance and gesture and movement and teaching and preaching and healing and responsibility as gift to the church. I bring a spirituality that our Black American bishops told us. They just told us what everybody who knew. That spirituality is contemplative and biblical and holistic, bringing to religion a totality of mind and imagination, of memory, of feeling and passion and emotion and intensity. A faith that is embodied, incarnate praise, a spirituality that knows how to find joy even in the time of sorrow, that steps out on faith, that leans on the Lord, a spirituality that is communal, that tries to walk and talk and work and pray and play together. Even with the bishop, you know, when our bishops are around, we want to be where we can find them, where we can reach out and touch them, where we can talk to them. Don't be too busy, y'all. A spirituality that in the middle of your mass or in the middle of your sermon just might have to shout out and say, amen, hallelujah, thank you, Jesus. To be spirit-filled. The old lady said, if you love the Lord your God with your whole heart and your whole soul and your whole mind and all your strength, then you praise the Lord with your whole heart and soul and mind and strength, and you don't bring him any feeble service. If you get enough fully functioning Black church Catholics in your diocese, they gonna hold up the priest and they gonna hold up the bishop. We love our bishops, y'all. We love y'all too. But see, these bishops are our own, ordained for the church universal, ordained for the service of God's people. But they ours. We raised them. They came for our community. And in a unique way, they can speak for us and to us. And that's what the church is talking about, indigenous leadership. The leaders are supposed to look like their folks. Ain't that what the church does? Black and Catholic means to realize that the work of the ordained ministers is not a threat to me And I'm no threat to that. The work of the ordained minister, of the professional minister, is to enable the people of God to do the work of the church, to feed us sacramentally, to enable us to preach and to teach. And I ain't necessarily talking about preaching in the pulpit. You know as well as I do that some of the best preaching does not go on in the pulpit. But as a Catholic Christian, I have a responsibility to preach and to teach, to worship and to praise. Black folk can't just come into church and depend on the priest and say, let Father do it. And if Father don't do right, then they walk out and they complain. You know, that liturgy didn't do anything for me. The question that we raise is, what did you do for the liturgy? And the church is calling us to be participatory and to be involved. The church is calling us to feed and to clothe and to shelter and to teach. And your job to enable me, to enable God's people, Black people, white people, brown people, all the people to do the work of the church in the modern world.
Okay. So is there any lines that stuck out for people?
I think when she talked a little bit about having that representation of having like I guess priests and bishops that grew up in their community to talk for their community, that spoke out a lot, because that's definitely something that I've seen in churches when the priest happens to be of the same ethnic background as the parishioners. There's just some type of connection there that doesn't always happen when it's not the same like ethnic background. So I definitely I agree with her on that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, representation matters, right? Like you hear it again and again, right? That if like there's a limitation there. I mean, I have on in my classroom at Blanchette, because I never had to decorate a classroom before. So I was like, oh, I never had to think about this. But the one thing I did get was I got 5 different posters with saints from each continent, right? Excluding Antarctica and Australia, right? If you're like 5, that's not. But the reason was that because I was like, so many times as people of color, like we don't see ourselves in Catholicism, right? And I didn't want a kid to leave my classroom thinking that way, right? Now they might not want to be Catholic, right? That's their prerogative, right? But I wanted them to see that there's a space for like people who look like them within Catholicism. So yeah, representation absolutely is important. Anyone else?
I think for me, it was kind of 2 things into one that go with each other. When she talked about shouting out in the middle of a homily or a sermon, right? It's this very kind of what I think of almost as charismatic, style that, just it's the Spirit moving us, right? And, in some ways I've had in my history, as a lay minister, I've had different feelings about, kind of the charismatic expression, but, at the end of the day, you really can't look at it without realizing that the Spirit's moving somebody in that moment, right? And they're reacting to that, they're rejoicing, that gives them that sense of joy, and that's powerful. And so in the moment of, preaching, right, which is something that, again, our priests, our deacons, are even in lay preaching, right, it's meant to inspire us. So we are in a sense, supposed to respond, with the things that we feel in a moment of inspiration, right? And that's, a really wonderful thing. But normally speaking, during a homily means you're being rude or disrespectful. But in this case, that's definitely not true. And then also just kind of dovetailing that, the idea of some of the best preaching happening off the pulpit, which really spoke to me, right? Especially as, someone who does try to evangelize, right, in the base of my work, right, as a youth and young adult minister. I don't consider myself the preachy type, but, if I'm to inspire, right, then, a lot of the themes of homiletics and such follow, and that I would want to be inspiring those, around me, and for them to inspire me, even if it's off the pulpit. So I think those two things were really speaking to me.
Yeah. It's funny, there was a moment I had this year that, James, I feel like you'll relate to. I was telling my students about the word apostle and where it comes from. And I was like, an apostle is really just somebody who's sent, right? If an epistle is a letter, right? An apostle is epistle is a letter that is sent. An apostle is a person that is sent, but it's the sending that's in common, right? And then my students were like, and I don't know how serious they were. They were probably just trying to mess with me, right? To be honest, they're like, Mr. Carlson, are you an apostle then? And I was like, very lowercase a, right? Like, let's be clear, but kind of, right? And that, that reflection of just because, we're not priests, we're not bishops, right? Doesn't mean that we're not called to preach, right? Especially as a youth, young adult minister of yourself, that is something that, that's a part of our calling, right? It's still to preach. It's not from the pulpit. It's not in, during mass, right? But it's also not excluded to us either. So for sure.
Thanks, James. You took mine.
Andrea, do you want to know more about it?
That's the one that spoke to me too. Only because I was reflecting and thinking about how much my mom makes fun of me about and you too, back in the day, Sam, trying to get me to go to church. And I'm like, but there's other ways. And then, I can hear preaching. I hear preaching. Not necessarily from the pulpit. It's like what James said. And that was when I heard that, I was like, I just reflected on how I'm always telling myself, that, I don't have, I know I'm not in church every Sunday as I should be, but that doesn't mean that I'm not being a part of church,
For sure. And I think that, on the flip side of that too, right? There are plenty of people out there who are going to church every Sunday, and that's all of the ways that they're being church, right? And it's like, no, Sunday is supposed to fuel you for the rest of the week.
Right.
And it's like, if you're not doing the work, you're just gorging yourself on spiritual food and not, exercising, right? You need both. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Vanessa said in the chat, the church is calling us to be participatory and to be involved. And I think that's kind of similar to what Andrea, what you're saying, this idea that I'm not just supposed to sit there, right, and be passive.
Yep.
Not just, go to church on Sunday and then not do anything the rest of the week.
I'd rather go out and do the whole week and then.
Right. And the sense that it's all working together, right? That, the mass and the spiritual life of the church. Even confession, right? Whenever I talk to my students, I'm like, there's a practical therapeutic value to say the things that I'm most ashamed of to a human person out loud, right? I take a certain command over the thing that is, weighing on me, right? And then to hear that I'm forgiven for that, right? Purely therapeutically, that can be transformational. Add on the spiritual component of that, and you've got something really powerful. But right, that's a tough thing too. And so the sacramental life is again meant to be kind of the force or the fuel that kind of keeps us moving, right? And if it's not that Monday through Saturday faith, right, we're still is for what, is kind of the question. So awesome. Well, I want to look at some specific examples of holiness, and I've kind of broken it down into 3 different sections, just in kind of thinking about the African-American saints that are most popular or most well-known. They kind of fit in these, distinctive categories. So we're going to look at kind of the early monastics, because there are these kind of Christianity was in Africa around the same time it was in Europe, and I think sometimes we forget about that, that with the history of, effectively with the history of Islam kind of coming in, that Christianity was in Africa before then, and it was a dominant religion in the area. So it's not just colonialism that brings Christianity, right? And then we're going to look at religious sisters, right? Because specifically in terms of the United States, but also elsewhere, African American religious sisters have done a lot of work for the life of the church in the United States, and so acknowledging some key contributors there is really important. And then lastly, folks specifically to the American context and African Americans who can specifically speak to what it means to be an African American Catholic and what holiness looks like in that context. So firstly, the early monastics. So there's three early monastics that are very kind of famously from Africa. There's Saint Anthony of Egypt, who is known as really the father of all Christian monasticism. This idea of kind of interior spirituality and kind of working on the life of virtue, the life of the hermit, right? All of these things that we kind of associate with what it means to be a monk in Christianity, right, really comes from Saint Anthony. Benedict develops it kind of uniquely for the West, and in a way that works very well communally. But Anthony of Egypt is really kind of the founder of Christian monasticism in the East, really more so, but he's earlier than Benedict, so then people, credit him with the general father of all monasticism. So anyway, so Saint Anthony of Egypt, credited as the founder of Christian monasticism. His biography by Athanasius, right, also helps to spread the concept of Christian monasticism, right? So even the concept of an early monastic, right, is an African, or it's rooted in the continent of Africa. It's that kind of origin. And then two other folks, right? Saint Benedict the Moor, born of enslaved Africans in San Fratello. He was freed at birth and became known for his charity. As a young man, he joined a Franciscan affiliated hermit group, of which he became the leader. And his charity is actually, I think, one of the key things that kind of, if we're talking about like his heroic virtue in life for others, right? His willingness to give of himself to others. His saint picture, you can't quite see it here. If I were to like escape out and then kind of show you the cropping, he's got like an absurd amount of like bread loaves in his hand. And it's because of that kind of willingness to give his food out to the poor. And then Saint Moses the Black. Saint Moses the Black is one of my favorite saints, just because his stories, it's very dramatic, very intense. He was a brigand, a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? A thief, right? He was a criminal, right? In any sense of the word. And essentially what happened was he was kind of hunting down somebody who owed him, or no, I think he was hunting down somebody to take something from them, and then they kind of escaped. And then he kind of stole some stuff from somebody else. And, he was also a very kind of physically imposing person. I think one of the stories talks about him like swimming across the Nile with like, 4 goats like in his arms or something, just like in crazy physical strength, right? But what happens is he's kind of on the run at one point in his life. And in order to kind of find safety, he joins these monks. And he's moved by their holiness, by their contemplativeness, and by their peacefulness. And so he joins the order of the monks and becomes one of the more famous folks in a tradition called the Desert Fathers, and kind of converts from a life of crime to a life of contemplative spirituality. And there's 3 specific stories I want to highlight, specifically Saint Moses the Black. There's 3 stories that kind of come out of his life that I think are really essential. So the first one is he had been robbed, right, for a certain good of his, by one of his brothers in the monastery, and then the brother was caught, and they were like, we're gonna judge him, we're gonna kind of kick him out, we're gonna have a trial, and we want Saint Moses the Black to be there. And he said, I'm not gonna be there, I don't want to be there. And they said, no, you need to be there. You were the person you're the victim here, you gotta be centered. And he's like, no, I don't want to be there. So they would say, you have to come, right? You don't have a choice. He's like, okay. So he shows up, and the tradition here kind of varies, but the point is the same. He's either carrying a wicker basket full of sand, and you can imagine, a wicker basket with sand, right? Not all the sand's going to stay in. Or it's a leaky jug, again, with the water kind of falling out. And his brothers, they're confused. They're like, why are you bringing this jug or this basket? Hello, Owl. And he says this line at the top here. He says, my sins run out behind me, right? And today I am coming to judge the errors of another, right? This kind of emphasis of, who am I to judge anybody, right? I myself, have my own history of sin, my own history of stealing specifically, right? And so this idea of mercy, right? Mercy, but also in the context of recognizing my own sins, my own shortcomings, I think is really powerful spiritually. There's another time in which he was being mocked by some of his brothers for his complexion, right? Being of darker complexion. And he just doesn't say anything about it. And then eventually, some other brothers kind of come up to him, and they say, weren't you grieved? Weren't you upset by them making fun of you like that? And he says, I was grieved, but I kept silence. And I wanted to highlight that just because I think it's so relatable. I think, all of us, as people of color have had an experience, or two at least, inside the church or outside the church, in which we've had that experience and not knowing what to do and just, trying to process it, right? And that feeling of, being grieved, but keeping silence. And then lastly, the third one, so there was this kind of order among the monks that they were supposed to fast for a period of time. And some guests come to visit him, right? And so what does he do, right? Well, he's a good monastic, right? He cooks them some food, and some of his other brothers are like, oh yeah, he's eating, they're all mad, right? They're like, he broke the rule, he was supposed to be fasting and he's not fasting. And so they get him in trouble, and they bring him to the ministers, who are, I think it was kind of like a state thing, but they bring him to the people who were in charge of the fast, basically, and they are the ones who say, you did not keep the commandment of men, but it was so that you might keep the commandment of God. And again, right, that sense of priority spiritually, right? That, like, what's more important, right? To follow the law of fasting or to follow the law of God in serving my neighbor, right? Well, the neighbor seems to be more essential to what God calls us to do. So those are a couple quick stories about Saint Moses the Black, that I think highlight. I mean, I think he kind of gets dramatized as like this rough and tumbled brigand who has no time for any nonsense, right? And there's a piece of that in his story, but I think if you actually read more about him, you get to know this well-rounded character of a person who is deeply spiritual, and you can see why the early life of the church falls in love with him so much. So that's kind of our monastics. In terms of women religious, we have Mother Mary Elizabeth Lang, who is the foundress of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. And this is the first African-American religious congregation. She was also through the Oblates because she was the first superior of them, the first ever African-American mother superior. She's also a servant of God, so that means the process is still along the way. Just very kind of holy, very strong woman. I think for many of these women, especially in the time that they were in, right, to be women and women of color serving in the life of the church in this way, right, required a really an external strength, I think, to some degree, but also a deep interior strength, to endure and to fight against a lot of things. And a lot of, at least for Henriette Lille, there was a couple times she founded a religious order, and then that it didn't last. So that capacity to really continue to recognize that there's a need here, and to continue to kind of do your best to bring to fruition something to solve the problem, I think is really profound, especially in ways in which we today try to bring about justice in our world, and the times in which we feel shut down by that. So speaking of that, Venerable Henriette Lille, She was a Louisiana Creole of color. So in Louisiana specifically, right, there was a lot of more interracial mixing, and so right, there were kind of, I mean, there was still kind of this sense of like, if you were white, you were white. If you were of color, you were of color. But that line wasn't as sharp as in other parts of the South. And so she was a Creole of color and a Catholic nun from New Orleans who founded the Sisters of the Holy Family. And this is the second oldest surviving congregation of African-American nuns, right? And again, right, she founded a few orders before the Sisters of the Holy Family. So again, that endurance, I think, is a theme that when you look at the lives of the African-American saints, right, that ability to endure and to persist, right, is something you see over and over again. And then last but certainly not least, St. Josephine Bakhita. So it says here, after having been a slave in Sudan from age 7 to 8, St. Josephine gained her freedom through joining the Canossians, the Sudanese Italian religious sister, lived in Italy for 45 years. She was known as the Madre Moretta, or the Black Mother of the town of Schio in Italy, and was believed to be responsible for the protection of the town during World War II. There was a lot of bombings happening in Italy at the time, and Schio was kind of left unharmed. And people believed it was because of the holiness of St. Josephine Bakhita. Also, I think her story is kind of an interesting one because she's enslaved in Sudan by a white slave owner who then she had to go somewhere. So she left Josephine and her daughter, the daughter of the slave owner, in Italy with the Canossian sisters. And at the time in Italy, it was illegal to own slaves. And so basically and Josephine kind of had her own spiritual journey while she was staying at the Canossians, right? But there's also this kind of interesting moment where Josephine, when she's in Italy, she's like, well, actually, I want to stay with the Canossians. And there was nothing her slave owner could do, because what's she going to do? Call the authorities to have her come home? Well, slavery was illegal. She didn't have any right to do that, right? So the Canossians in many ways were the way in which Josephine was able to be liberated from her experience in slavery. And then I wanted to, with Josephine Bakhita specifically, I've got the longer quote in the comments here. There's a quote from Pope Benedict XVI in his encyclical on Spe Salvi. Sorry, it's a long one. I'll try to read it quickly. Spe Salvi, which is on hope, in which he talks about Josephine Bakhita as a model of hope in the world. And so what I thought we could do is kind of similar to the Thea Bowman exercise. I'll read it, and then what I want you to do is identify a moment or a scene or a quote or a sentence that sticks out to you, and then just share why that stuck out to you. Okay. So he says, yet at this point, a question arises, in what does this hope consist? Which, as hope, is redemption. The essence of the answer is given in the phrase from the letter to the Ephesians quoted above. The Ephesians, before their encounter with Christ, were without hope because they were without God in the world. To come to know God, the true God, means to receive hope. We who have always lived with the Christian concept of God and have grown accustomed to it have almost ceased to notice that we possess the hope that ensures from a real encounter with God, or with this God. The example of a saint of our time can to some degree help us understand what it means to have a real encounter with this God for the first time. I am thinking of the African Josephine Bakhita, canonized by Pope John Paul II. She was born around 1869. She herself did not know the precise date, in Darfur in Sudan. At the age of 9, she was kidnapped by slave traders, beaten till she bled, and sold 5 times in the slave markets of Sudan. Eventually, she found herself working as a slave for the mother and the wife of a general, and there she was flogged every day till she bled. As a result of this, she bore 144 scars throughout her life. Finally, in 1882, she was bought by an Italian merchant for the Italian consul Callisto Legnani, who returned to Italy as the Mahdists advanced. Here, after the terrifying masters who had owned her up to that point, Bakita came to know a totally different kind of master. In Venetian dialect, which she was now learning, she used the name Paron for the living God, the God of Jesus Christ. Up to that time, she had only known masters who despised her and maltreated her, or at best considered her a useful slave. Now, however, she heard that there is a Paron above all masters, the Lord of all lords, and that this Lord is goodness in person. She came to know that this Lord even knew her, that he had created her, that he actually loved her. She too was loved, and by none other than the supreme Paron, before whom all other masters are themselves no more than lowly servants. She was known and loved, and she was awaited. What is more, this master had himself accepted the destiny of being flogged, and now he was waiting for her at the Father's right hand. Now she had hope, no longer simply the modest hope of finding masters who would be less cruel, but the great hope. I am definitively loved, and whatever happens to me, I am awaited by this love, and so my life is good. Through the knowledge of this hope, she was redeemed, no longer a slave, but a free child of God. She understood what Paul meant when he reminded the Ephesians that previously they were without hope and without God in the world, without hope because without God. Hence, when she was baptized, or when she was about to be taken to Sudan, Bakita refused. She did not wish to be separated again from her Paron. On January 9, 1890, she was baptized and confirmed and received her first Holy Communion from the hands of the Patriarch of Venice. On December 8th, 1896, in Verona, she took her vows in the congregation of the Canossian sisters, and from that time onwards, besides her work in the sacristy and in the porter's lodge at the convent, she made several journeys around Italy in order to promote the missions. The liberation she had received through her encounter with the God of Jesus Christ, she felt she had to extend. It had to be handed on to others, to the greatest possible number of people. The hope born in her, which had redeemed her, she could not keep to herself. This hope had to reach many, to reach everybody. Okay, so what stuck out to people? What were some parts of her story that resonated?
The fact that she had all those scars.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I guess that she was able to realize that not everyone was not everyone what's the word that she used? That not everyone was bad, or I had the word in my head, but because I'm eating. Huh?
Like cruel?
No, what was the name of the is it the Masters? Is that what they call them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, the Paron is the Italian word.
The Paron, yeah, but right, but that she was able to see that not everyone, that he was different.
Yeah.
That she wasn't. They're not all the same. They're not all gonna mistreat them and abuse them. So that the fact that she was able to see that there is good in other people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in many ways, right, this is one of the proofs for God, right, that the longing that we have for, right, a perfect loving parent or a perfect loving, master, antiquated, but in her time that was a real experience and a real connection she had, right? That one who loved us, not one who hated us, or not one who loved us perfectly, not one who loves us imperfectly. I think points to, right, this sense that there is a hole that I'm looking to be filled, and that can only be filled by God, right? Absolutely.
I was thinking how many people, when they go through rough times, or they have a bad experience, they assume that the next experience will be the same. Or this person, I've had a bad experience with this type of person, so I can, so it's not giving those people a chance.
Right.
And it's understandable, but the fact that, that she, was able to get, in a way, given that second chance and see that goodness in that Paron, that was different than the other Parons. And being able to turn to God. I mean, that's what I always wonder, like, and I do this with my brothers. When I have a brother who complains a lot about everything, and he always talks about, talks about everything is just the same, people are just the same, all jobs are the same, and it's just like, I always want to, or he tells me something happened, and I always want to tell him, what if you turn to God, if you, because he's so distant from the church, he's so, doesn't believe it, but I have to stop myself from telling them because I already know the response he's going to give me. And it's just like, there's so many people out there like that if they were to turn to God, they, you'd be surprised what they may find,
And I mean, it's tough for people, I think, because oftentimes people understand participation in the church as like turning to the church for their faith. But I think anybody who's like stuck in with the faith, right, I think realizes, like, if I had faith in the church, like, I would not be here, right? Like, you're like the church. There's the great story I love. It's a bit, controversial, but there's a Christian and a Jewish person in the Middle Ages, right? And they're trying to convert each other. And over time, right, the Christian kind of starts to win out, and the Jewish person is like, all right, I'll become a Christian, but I need to go to Rome first. Now, at the time, Rome is like super corrupt, right? All the scandal, right? In many ways, kind of puts the scandal we have today to shame. Like, it's like political scandal, murder, like adultery, sexual intrigue, like all of the, like, the conspiracies that people have today, like actual, right? Like, that's what's going on in Rome. So this guy's like, no, don't go to Rome. Like, Rome is like, if you want to be a faithful Christian, like, you will not last in Rome, even though it's the capital, like, it's not going to work. And the Jewish person's like, no. Like, if I'm going to be a Catholic, like, I got to see the capital. I got to see what's going on. Right. She's like, oh gosh. So he goes to Rome, he comes back. And the Jewish person's like, okay, I'm going to become a Catholic. And he's like, what? You saw all that corruption, you saw all that scandal, you saw all that drama, and you still want to be Catholic? And he's like, well, yeah, because there's no way that y'all would have lasted 1,500 years with all of this going on unless God was involved with it. Like, that's the only way that we would have survived. And I think that there's something true there, that it's like, I think it's important that we don't necessarily put our faith in, right, the human institution. I mean, there's a reality to the church, is the way in which, right, God brings about salvation, but it's also a human institution. It's also flawed and broken. And that kind of recognition that, like, my faith is in God primarily, right? And that's what's going to keep me going. That's what's going to make me put up with these yahoos in the church who are trying to make it work, right? But they look at me and they're like, I'm a yahoo. I'm doing my own stuff that's crazy, right? So to quote Pope Francis, who am I to judge, right? We're all a bunch of yahoos trying to make it work, right?
Yes, I am the yahooiest. That's that's me right there. Yep, that about sums it up. No, I was gonna comment. I think what I took away, well, I took a lot of things away from the quote, but I think what stuck out to me was kind of her idea, or what he said about despite what happens to me, I don't remember exactly what it said, but it was along the lines of, like, despite what happens to me, I'm loved, right? feeling this love despite what goes on in my life, and kind of that pointing to God, right? I mean, oftentimes, especially being a youth and young adult minister, I'm not explaining, but I'm helping guide people to realize that that God is present through our toughest times, right? And that there is that sense of love, right? Sometimes we have to look for it in ways that we wouldn't think we'd have to, right? But that's the workings of and movements of God that we're not necessarily meant to understand, but that we do understand. We can understand love, right? And I think that kind of stuck out to me from the passage.
Yeah, and I mean it's kind of overplayed, right? But the Footsteps poem, I think, is still a rich, metaphor, right? Again, like it's cliche, and you're like, oh, you were carrying me, but there's like we've all been carried at one point in our life, right? We all know what it's like to be in that bottom of bottoms, right? And to experience that sense of like, I am not the one that's bringing me out of this because I'm a mess, right? The Yahooist, as you say, right? And yeah, right. I think that love as resonating through all of it, I think is so true, right? Vanessa said in the chat, the same quote that you're actually highlighting, and whatever happens to me, I am awaited to this love. She took it, I think, a little different direction, but she says this represents what is included in James Cone's roots and principles of Black theology, the hope that God is the supreme liberator and liberation will come eventually, whether in the present or the afterlife. Absolutely. I think that that's so essential. And if you look at, so many of the kind of movements of liberation within kind of African-American context, right? It's all kind of this, it's inspired by love, really, right? Love for God, love for my neighbor, love for my children and their generations, and me not wanting them to go through what I went through, right? Like there's so much there about love as the source of liberation, right? That is really behind Saint Josephine's life, right? Because I'm always blown away because when as a sister, you hear all these stories of people just like loving her in Italy, right? That they're just like, she's like the nicest, the sweetest, she takes care of everybody. And I'm like, she had a terrible life leading up to that, right? And it's not like, I mean, religious life is not exactly a life of comfort, or at least usually not. I don't know what maybe the Canossians were living it up, but usually it's not like this very easy life, right? And I was just that she wasn't embittered by that, but that she was able to see that it was love who liberated her, right? That God, and I think her conversion to Catholicism so closely connected to her liberation from slavery, right? Makes that particularly clear for her. And that's so too, she liberates others through love, right? Just a really profound witness, I think, to that. Awesome. Yeah, so I've got a couple more folks. Then I want to talk about some contemporary African-American Christians who are doing some great stuff. So American trendsetters, right? The folks who have kind of really transformed what it means to be an African-American and Catholic today. So we talked about servant of God, Thea Bowman earlier, Black Catholic religious sister, teacher, and scholar who became an evangelist among African-Americans, and assisted in the production of an African-American Catholic hymnal, and was a popular speaker, right, on faith and spirituality. She's a really fun one. She grew up in Mississippi, which is not exactly a very Catholic area of the world, and like went to Catholic school, and like I think at like the age of 9 told her parents she wanted to be Catholic, and they're like, okay, like if that's what you want, and then like also at a pretty young age decides she wants to join the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration in Wisconsin. So goes from Mississippi to Wisconsin, right? And just she's such a unique person, and like is very much kind of like her own like force of spirituality and of love and of energy, right? As y'all saw in the video. Just a dynamic person. Wilton Cardinal Gregory, from Chicago, so get a local reference there. And is the first Black cardinal. Actually, he was made a cardinal very recently in 2020. There's a good news clip on one of the morning shows. I think it's like CBS Morning or ABC Morning or something like that. Of him talking about kind of what it means to be the first Black cardinal. But even before that, right, he was also the first Black president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And then he was also the Archbishop of Atlanta, and then is now the Archbishop of Washington, D.C. In the interview, actually, he talks about being the Archbishop with a Catholic president in Washington, D.C., and kind of what he anticipates his relationship with Joe Biden will look like. And how he says, there are times in which, like, I'm going to say, how can I support you? How can I help you? How can, we, obviously you as a Catholic person are inspired by your faith with many of your policies. How can we work together? There's going to be times where I disagree with him, and, and then kind of talks about that, like, ultimately, right, he's his own person who's moved by his conscience, but, working together, but also not kind of too closely because church and state, and wanting to, respect the distance between that. And lastly, Venerable Augustus Tolton was born a slave in Missouri, who was baptized and raised Catholic. He studied formally in Rome. He studied a lot before he ended up getting to Rome. That's why I say formally. His official education for the priesthood was in Rome, but he studied a lot leading up to that. He was the first Roman Catholic priest in the United States, publicly known to be Black. There are a couple other priests, I think, before that point, who weren't known to be Black when they were ordained, but later came out that they were of African descent. But he's the first one that when he was ordained, they knew he was Black, and then he served in the United States. And then Tolton first ministered to his home parish in Quincy, Illinois. Quincy, Illinois was a little closer to the Illinois-Missouri border, and so there was a decently sized population of African Americans who were escaping slavery from Missouri, who found themselves in Quincy, and then was later eventually assigned to Chicago. And when I think about Tolton, this idea of endurance, which I think I've talked about a couple of times with other saints, really comes to the fore. He felt called to the priesthood at a pretty young age. Like maybe 15, 16 years old, and did not get to become a priest or even, get to the seminary until 5-10 years later, because of prejudice, right? Because of racial prejudice. And he had applied to seminaries all over the country, and got a range of answers from, on the one hand, the most kindest, right, would be kind of, well, we support what you're doing, but we're not ready to do that. Or, the parishioners, right, the white parishioners would not be comfortable with that. We can't ordain a priest, we'd lose donations, etc. Right. To kind of the more, dramatic, right, we're not going to accept a Black person, basically. And in many ways, it kind of worked out in his favor because he studies in Rome, right? This kind of very acclaimed, right? This very, astute, right? I mean, any priest I think would want to study in Rome, right? And so he gets this really great honor because the U.S. won't allow it. But in Rome, right, it's a much more global city, right? He actually studies to be a missionary, right? And obviously there are missionaries from all over the country or from all over the world, right? So, to have a Black priest wasn't as big of a deal there. And so they train him there. And then he's just a great symbol of endurance. I want to read a quote from his biography that I think talks about, that kind of gets at the heart of this. This is him. This is when he's in Chicago, and he's trying to serve the needs of the Black Catholics in Chicago. He's also hoping to build a church for the Black Catholics in Chicago. But I think this quote gets at it. It says, "The black-robed priest became a familiar figure in the littered streets and foul-smelling alleys of his district. He laid aside his red sash, the emblem of his affiliation with the Pontifical Seminary," right? So he laid aside his kind of symbol of his training in Rome, "and appeared always in his well-worn, faded cassock. Day after day, he was seen coming in or out of the shacks, the rat-infested hovels, and tenement houses. He listened compassionately to complaints of unemployment, desertion, injustice, depravity. Father Tolton knew how to bring hope and comfort to the sick and dying. He knew how to mitigate human suffering and sorrow because he himself had experienced the lash of the slave driver as well as the lash of the white man's tongue. His great heart ached for all his fellow Blacks, not just for the members of his parish. It is safe to say that Father Tolton understood the soul of his race better than did any other cleric or prelate of his time." Yes, Tolton dies, I want to say at 47. And I think it would not be too unreasonable for me to say that he really just dies. He kind of works himself to death. He's so in love with his faith, and he's so in love with his people, right? With African Americans, that, he cannot, go on without doing everything he possibly can to bring the joy of the gospel and the life of faith and the hope that comes with that, right, to his community. And he's just an incredible witness, I think, especially for folks who want to minister to the downtrodden, right, who want to be models of liberation theology. And it's funny, when I was going through kind of a tough time of feeling like I needed to say more, I needed to do more, and I wasn't getting like a lot of chances to talk about things. And my girlfriend was like, go to Tolton, like bring it to prayer with Tolton, because if anybody knows how to endure difficulty, right, like it's Augustus Tolton. And I didn't quite appreciate him until I read his biography, and then I got a deeper sense of, what does it mean to be the first Black priest in America, and what does that look like? And just the selflessness of it is inspiring. So before we wrap up, I want to highlight some folks and some organizations who are dedicated to Black Catholicism today. And I wanted to, for the people, I wanted to include folks in different kind of vocations. We've got priests, we've got religious, and then we've got kind of lay folks. And then two specific organizations that work for Black Catholicism. So first of all, Father Brian Massengale, very famous author of the book Racial Justice in the Catholic Church. If you haven't read it, highly recommend. Gives kind of a full picture and a challenge to the church on racial justice. He's a scholar activist, right, who's advancing racial justice in society today. He's interviewed a decent amount on the topic of racial justice and Catholicism specifically. So if you want to know kind of the state of things and the things that maybe Catholicism does well, but also the things that it's not doing well, certainly having an ad hoc committee on racism is, it's good to have a committee, but is it enough, I think, is the question. But Father Brian Massengale really is doing a good job holding the human institution of the church accountable. The National Black Catholic Congress, founded in 1987, its mission is to improve and enrich the lives of African American Catholics, working closely with the Black bishops of the USCCB. They're, again, pretty connected to the specific issues of, being a Black person who is Catholic, right? Dealing with issues like racism, dealing with issues like how can I, practice my own unique African spirituality, right? As Sister Thea said, right? How can I bring my whole self, my Black self, to the church? What does that look like for me, right? Because it's a different experience than than a lot of different racial or ethnic backgrounds in the church. Gloria Purvis, awesome person. She's a African-American Catholic speaker and podcaster, whole life advocate or activist from the, I believe it was Cardinal Bernardine who talks about womb to tomb, right? The kind of seamless garment, right? The whole picture of life. I think on her podcast, she's recently talked about is immigration a life issue, right? And is, a lot of other things that we normally don't think of as, pro-life or whatever. It, like, should that also be a part of the conversation? She is best known as the co-host of Morning Glory, which was a show on EWTN around the time that George Floyd was killed. She began to speak up a little bit more about kind of what it meant to be Black and Catholic and Black Lives Matter. And surprised the show was pulled, right? Probably because she was so outspoken. She landed on her feet. She's got a podcast with America now, so good for her. We're happy she's still able to have a platform. But even within the church, right? Obviously, there's still ramifications for speaking up. The Society of Saint Joseph is a religious order specifically dedicated to serving African Americans. Actually, they were pretty early on connected to Augustus Tolton, and they're kind of the exception to why he wasn't ordained to the U.S. They had an order in Baltimore, and he appealed to them. He's like, "Hey, can I train to be a priest with y'all?" And they're like, "We'd love to have you, but we don't have a seminary yet." At least they didn't have it in the U.S. He would have had to go to England, I think, to train, which wasn't exactly ideal unless you were going to Rome, right? But right, the Josephites very committed to being present to the African American community. They're primarily, I know they have a big impact or a big footprint in New Orleans and in the South. But they serve a lot in African American parishes, I think, is primarily where they have a lot of their work. Yeah. And then lastly, Sister Desiree. I think she's from the Chicago area. James, maybe you can correct me on that, because I know you've done some stuff with her. She's a Felician sister and a dancer. I think especially if you're looking for unique ways to live out one's vocation, right? She trained to be a dancer and then was like, I'm called to religious life, and gave it up, or at least she thought she did, and then has found a new way to live out her faith through this this form of expression, right? And she dances on Instagram, which anytime like young religious are on Instagram, I'm like, y'all are cool, like here for it, but she dances on Instagram, and then also blogs at Religious Life for Beginners. So these are some folks who are still, who are kind of representing Black Catholicism today. If you're looking for more information about, what it means to be Black and Catholic in the 21st century and how to kind of tap into that life or that spirituality, I think that's a place. These are some folks who you can kind of look for more information. So
I just looked her up on Instagram. I didn't see her.
Any other questions or thoughts or concerns? I'm gonna stop sharing now, just so we can.
We're definitely going to want to look up some people that you mentioned to read about, because it's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's some really cool stories of folks, and when we think about like what it means to be a saint and who are the saints that we hear about, that we embrace, right? Saint Francis of Assisi is a popular saint, right? Saint Oscar Romero, obviously very popular. Joan of Arc, right? All these saints that have kind of done these heroic, dramatic things, right? And you kind of say, well, like, who's being a saint today, right? Like, there's a lot of really good examples, I think, in African American Catholicism, in Latinx Catholicism, in Asian American Catholicism, right? That, like, the church is moving south, right? And I think you see that in the lives of faith, right? That these kind of heroic, saintly people, right, are also coming from the South, the global South, to be clear.